Welcome to what is the penultimate session of the day. It doesn't really need much introduction because I know this issue has come up in so many of the sessions that we've discussed already today. But the session is about innovation in cybersecurity. So we're going to be looking at how governments are innovating to keep their systems and their data secure from that threat that's ever changing, those kind of cyber threats. I know I've said this on a lot of our panels today, but we really do have a stellar panel with us here today. So again, I'm going to ask our speakers to keep their opening remarks quite short so that you can really pick their brains and make best use of the fantastic experts that we have here in the room with us here today. So we are going to hear from Lindy Cameron, who is CEO of the National Cyber Security Agency here in the UK, and then Claire, who we heard from this morning, Claire Martorana, who is the Federal Chief Information Officer at the Executive Office of the President, so the White House in the United States of America. Then we'll hear from Anne Duncan, who is Chief Information Officer at the Department of Energy in the United States of America. I hadn't realized until I met Anne in Ottawa how huge that department is, so massive remit. Then we will hear from Brian Abrahamson, who is Associate Laboratory Director and Chief Digital Officer at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, also in the United States. As you can see, there's a bit of an American contingent here. And then we will hear from David Carroll, who's the Managing Director of Nominet, one of our knowledge partners today. And last but not least at all, we will hear from Ian McCormack, who is Deputy Director of the Government Cyber Resilience at the National Cybersecurity Centre, also here in the UK. So without further ado, Lindy, I'm going to ask you for your opening comments.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. And it's great to be here today, not least because I missed both a bus and a train on the way here, so I'm delighted to have made it. It's also brilliant to be on a panel which is gender balanced, which is quite unusual in cybersecurity, so hurrah and well done to the organisers. So the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK is actually an innovation in itself, in that we are part of the UK's intelligence services, but we are a deeply open and transparent part of it. We were set up 7 years ago to try and bring cybersecurity out into the open, because although GCHQ, our parent organisation, had been giving fantastic cybersecurity advice, basically most people had been ignoring it. And so part of the innovation was trying to actually listen to our customers, not a really radical concept for those of you involved in digital services, but actually quite a radical notion for the intelligence services, thinking about its widespread customers in cybersecurity and thinking about how we serve them better. And since then, we've tried really hard to continue that spirit of innovation in the way we operate as NCSC. We continually try and drive innovation at the cutting edge of what it is that we and only we can do. We think of ourselves right at the sort of apex of the pyramid of cybersecurity, the team captain here in the UK, very much thinking about what it is that we can do and we can innovate, but then actually ideally we can hand off to the private sector. And in our wildest dreams, frankly, we wouldn't need to do very much, partly because the market would respond to try and create the technology that not only offers people economic opportunity, but also offers them security as they do it. But to be blunt, those markets haven't always succeeded, and I think we've seen that most critically probably in the telecom sector, but actually also more widely in commodity products which are sold basically without things like default secure passwords, without the kind of, frankly, default settings that allow individuals and organizations to keep themselves safe online without having to become cybersecurity experts. We do, however, rely very heavily on the private sector, and I think what you've seen, for example, in the last year during the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been a really important role for the private sector in innovating ways that the private sector can support governments to build their own resilience. It's quite an extraordinary story, actually, over the last year in the face of really extreme pressure from the Russian state. But we ourselves have also continued to innovate in what we call our active cyber defense services, which are a suite of products, a couple of which we actually launched today, to try and demonstrate what's possible. So today we launched a couple of new services for small and micro businesses, one called Check Your Cybersecurity, and the other Cyber Action Plan, both of which are designed to help small and micro businesses that don't have any IT experts, often don't have anybody who really knows what cybersecurity is, to run through a checklist that gives them some really simple, practical tips on what they can do to improve their security now, but also to point them in the direction of the guidance we think they should be reading to try and then up their game. And we believe that eventually that should lead them to an ecosystem of private sector suppliers, many assured by us, who help to provide those small businesses with other services from small businesses, and indeed eventually actually to a sort of cadre of effectively the cyber equivalent of engineers with chartered status who are really respected and help to give great advice. And what we want is to try and create that ecosystem that innovates itself rather than simply being reliant on government for that. So with that, let me pause and hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you so much. Sorry, thank you so much. I was just going to say, really interesting the way you phrased it there, an ecosystem of public and private sector working to help each other and keep each other secure. Sorry, Claire, over to you.
No, I was going to say that was fantastic, and I'm looking forward to actually seeing some of your new products. You know, cybersecurity is really the ultimate team sport, and in the federal government in the United States, we have multiple departments that are dealing with cybersecurity. So we kind of think of it as a three-legged stool. We have our Defense Department, we have our National Intelligence Services, and then we have the federal government that is actually administering the government of the United States. And so we work in very close partnership with all of those components. And one of the most recent things that we have done since the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, cybersecurity has been a top priority. We put out an executive order. We followed up with something that was rather forward-leaning for us, which was our Zero Trust strategy. And we are continuing to evolve with our federal agencies, like the Department of Energy, really leading on the implementation of these fundamental and foundational things. The other thing that we're doing that has been rather innovative is we are trying to look at long-term systemic change, making sure that we are driving our funding and that we are enabling organizations to both build talent pools and also get the resources that they need. We are sharing information much more transparently and with the public, but also fluidly within the government. So we're really excited about cybersecurity. And as I said on the panel this morning about innovation in general, one of the things we think about as technologists often is never letting a good crisis go to waste. And so lots of innovation has been happening because of the threat environment that we're dealing in. And we are thinking about cybersecurity really as the point of the arrow that is allowing us to get some other work done, like IT modernization of those legacy systems that oftentimes are not secure, and also the customer experience that we're trying to drive universally across all of our tools and services. So we think about cybersecurity as an integral part of everyday operations and are also working hard with agencies like the Department of Energy on really making sure that DevSecOps is the way that we are operating, that we are secure by design, starting at the absolute beginning of any process for building modern tools and services.
Thanks, Claire. Some really key issues there. The real need, as you said, team sport, but more than any issue really, to be working across government really effectively. Nice to hear how the administration has made this a priority with some of the executive orders that President Biden has put out. And then I like what you said there about you can't let the fear of cyber attacks, though, stifle innovation. So they're really interesting, because I think that probably is a fear for a lot of civil servants in the room. Thank you, Claire. Anne, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here with my colleagues from the US and UK on, as Lindy pointed out, this lovely balanced panel. It's great. And I will spare all of you who were here before my description of what the Department of Energy does. If you weren't here earlier, we'll just say it's a whole lot of stuff. But I'd like to build a little bit on Claire's remarks about the National Cyber Strategy. So the strategy builds on work that's already been in progress across the government, and it really lays out an integrated strategy to reduce our risks as a nation, as well as individual departments, by engaging across the entire spectrum of actions we would take to protect our critical assets. And my office has been very much committed to that, to implementing that process. And in fact, where we're starting from is we've been waiting patiently, as were you waiting patiently, for this to be released, because we're in the process of updating DOE's cybersecurity strategy. So we wanted to make sure that our strategy was fully aligned with the national strategy. We always think that's a good idea to be going the same direction as the White House. And we also are very focused on the concept of collective defense.
It is absolutely critical. As you talked about, it's the ultimate team sport. We need to work together. It's part of the reason we come places like this, is to talk to our colleagues around the world to understand how we can work together better to protect all of our assets. Because, we used to say, oh, well, if you're better protected than the office down the street, then they'll get them and you'll be fine. And we just can't operate in the world like that anymore. We need to operate in a world where we work together to share, to learn lessons, and to move our collective defense, our collective support forward. And the strategy, I will also point out, is really recognizes the importance of the clean energy transition. The strategy specifically calls out the need to secure our clean energy future. That is one of the important things that DOE works on, is that transition to clean energy and our all of the above strategy towards clean energy. And we are working in DOE to ensure that we proactively make cybersecurity front and center, so that we put cybersecurity by design into assets that go on the energy grid in the future. Just like in our software products, we can't afford to bolt on security later anymore. We need to design that in to our strategy for delivering capability to the grid. So that's an important thing that we do in terms of collective defense. In addition, I just want to share that one of the things our labs do, our national labs, and Brian, as pointed out, is one of those represents one of those labs, is we do a lot of cybersecurity research. We have 9 or 10 out of the 17 labs that have large cybersecurity research programs. I would venture to guess they all have some sort of cyber research in their programs, even the ones that are very much sort of single mission science labs. And so last week, we convened a group of our researchers in Denver to talk about that. And we've identified over 100 different cybersecurity projects that are going on in our labs that we published a list. And that's actually not everything we identified, but some of them were classified, some of them they didn't want shared. But we had over 100 projects, and every one of those projects is helping to support the resilience of our labs, of DOE, of the US government, and the public at large, and hopefully of our allies here in the room. So that's just what I wanted to share before I pass on to Brian.
Thank you so much, Anne. So I think you're stressing there again that importance of collaboration, working kind of all across government and aligning all of the departmental strategies with the federal, the kind of national strategy. And then, as you say, for you particularly, building kind of cyber into everything that you do in terms of that energy transition, making sure it's built into that policy objective as you go forward. Thank you, Anne, and you've set up Brian nicely to talk about the work of the labs.
Yes, no, absolutely. So I spent the majority of my career in the private sector, and about 10 years ago I found my way into the National Laboratory System. And for those of you not familiar with the U.S. National Labs, they are a pretty special place. And as Anne pointed out, there are 17 national labs. Each one of these is a research and development organization unto itself, but with a common set of missions across the department that we're solving for. There's over 70,000 folks that are employed by the U.S. National Laboratories, and the missions span everything from fundamental sciences and kind of discovery for discovery's sake, through to climate, things like green energy or clean energy and decarbonization, the work we do in energy storage, grid resiliency and security, and then finally very large national security missions. So there's just a lot going on in that model. The national labs are intentionally designed not to compete with industry, so typically we're innovating kind of 5 or 10 years ahead of the curve, and then when we find innovations and things that we think have strong market relevance, we have mechanisms whereby we can license or transfer that technology or those innovations to industry, who are then better positioned to scale it up. So there's a lot of innovations that come out of the National Lab system just in general. And as Anne said, cybersecurity is just an incredibly important focus for the national labs, and it's not only for protecting our own home front, right? When you think about the missions that we have, including, right, a large part of the nuclear weapons design and stewardship of the stockpile and things like that in the US, we are a significant target from a cyber adversary perspective and from state actors, and so there's a lot that goes on there, but also really helping the energy sector and protecting the sector with different innovations and developing new models and new ways to do that. And from a national labs perspective, we do that across the entire spectrum of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And I'll give you just a few kind of quick examples to try to bring this to life for you. So from an identification perspective, some of you know that in the US there are over 3,000 electric utilities. And while some of these are quite large and they have all kinds of resources and expertise available to them from a cyber perspective, There are many that are very small municipalities or very small organizations. They simply don't have the resources, the money, or the expertise to understand their vulnerabilities, to identify their own risks. And while there's a lot of federal frameworks and things, and private sector frameworks and maturity models for that, they're not necessarily adapted to that model. So the national labs have come together and actually adapted a lot of those frameworks from CISA and others, specific to kind of small and mid-sized utilities, where we can go in and help them understand their vulnerabilities. So, communications on serial communications, right? Legacy communications infrastructure that we know connects in countries all around the world, a lot of our grid components together, inherently insecure. Understanding those risks and what to do about it is a big focus. From a protect perspective, we've actually got technology, something called Hallmark, that allows you to encrypt serial communications on legacy networks. And then finally, there's a parallel to that called Serial Tap. And Serial Tap allows you to take the telemetry on those legacy, now encrypted serial networks and plumb them into contemporary cyber monitoring capabilities where you can do anomaly detection, run AI algorithms and things like that to try to understand what's happening. So a lot of innovation that then gets kind of pushed into the sector. And then finally, from our perspective, we have also found a really unique partnership opportunity between kind of the public sector and the private sector in being an honest broker for information sharing. Situational awareness and knowledge is power. And so we have over 70% of the US, or 90% actually, of the transmission supporting utilities in the United States participating in a voluntary program where they actually feed their network telemetry into a central clearinghouse. It goes through some anonymization and it's treated with kind of the utmost care and confidence. But as situations evolve at one utility, right, we're able to provide that situational awareness out to the broader sector who might also be experiencing the challenges. So, for the labs to be able to exist as an honest broker, if you will, to facilitate that kind of thing is really critical. The last thing I'm just going to say is, we also really pride ourselves at laboratories in terms of building diverse and inclusive workforces, and I know that's been a great focus for this. And when we think about cyber, with the magnitude of the challenge we're facing and some of the geopolitical stuff that we've talked about today, creativity and innovation have got to be, first and foremost in solving those things, and that is the hallmark of diverse teams. So not only for us is it the right thing to do, right, it really makes a lot of business sense for us as we think about the challenges ahead. So.
Thank you so much, Ryan. There was so much in there. You talk very fast. Very, very fast. You packed in a lot there in those. But really, really interesting to hear about the work of the labs. I think a lot of people won't have known of the existence of the labs. And just the very existence, as you say, you've created a space where you can foster and facilitate innovation, but you yourselves then, by definition, become kind of attacks, potential cyber targets. And again, reiterating some of that work that you do to help from the public sector, to help the private sector, and help kind of organizations that don't have the capacity to do it themselves. Thank you so much. Brian, over to you. David,
Thanks.
over to you.
We got there. Thank you. Thanks, Siobhan. And thank you for inviting me to join this very esteemed panel. Almost daunting to be here, I'd say. But I'll offer a few short points from an industry perspective. The first one I'd say is we've heard today that innovation comes in many forms. It's really not all about looking for the next unicorn, although that's where we tend to go. So many of our national objectives have a cyber dimension to them, and it covers a broad range of activities, and there are many interdependencies, and really, that spans innovation policy, our initiatives, our tax regimes, creating the right environment, creating the platforms for safe experimentation, as well as operational initiatives and workforce growth. So I really don't envy the lot of the cyber policymaker. My first point is that it's incredibly necessary. We need it, and we're very grateful for it. It's crucial if we're going to safeguard our infrastructures and build resilience nationally, and defend the values and freedoms that really we have come to enjoy over the last few decades. My second point is that I think we're about to embark upon a whole new wave of cyber innovation. I'd characterize the first wave of cyber innovation as essentially trying to retrofit security to an inherently insecure environment. And if you look now at the UK, the US, and the EU cybersecurity policies, bearing in mind that I'm old enough to remember the first national cybersecurity policy here in the UK, when I think Francis Maude was the Cabinet Secretary. If you look at the richness and depth of our cybersecurity policies now compared to where we were 10 or 15 years ago, you will see just how far we've come and the legislation that we have passed since then to underpin that. And this is really, a good step forward if we're going to make our world secure by design. My next point is that industry really does want to help. If we took a poll of CEOs and asked them how many of them value an open, secure, and resilient internet, and if we asked them how many of them over the next 10 or 20 years have a business model that seeks to capitalize upon the opportunities presented by a knowledge-enabled internet and the opportunities for transformation of our digital economies, then I think you'd get a fairly comprehensive response, a sea of hands, saying that yes, this is important to us. So the challenge for industry is not at an atomic level to be good corporate citizens. We are good corporate citizens. We want to help. It's knowing at an institutional level how and where to help. And that's why it's enormously helpful to have this clarity of vision and strategy set out for us by government so that we can plug in the right places and that we can join the right initiatives and bring our heft to bear. Perhaps my main point is that innovation works best when our incentives are aligned. Businesses respond best to initiatives, to opportunities, incentives. And as policymakers, I'd urge you to stress test the validity of your assumptions, which, by the way, must include the incentives for those who would harm us in cyberspace, and to test those as early as possible via industry consultation. Consulting with industry, I'll confess, can be at times a fairly unrewarding experience. It takes a lot of grit and determination, but it does pay dividends. If we work together to do this, we can, I think, unlock our collective creativity. And that will enable us together to create that kind of smart regulation that removes regulatory barriers where it's safe to do so, that delivers procurement that accelerate innovation, that supports common international standards and gives us access to markets without compromising the values that we would not want to undermine. And I believe in a small way we're doing that by sitting here talking today. By way of a parting shot, and without wishing to sound too self-congratulatory, we've come a long way in the last decade. It's tempting to focus on the bad stuff that happens in cyber world, but then we look at the progress we've made in terms of innovation, our policies and strategies, our legislation, our regulation, the way that we share information. When I started out in cybersecurity, to be in possession of an indicator of compromise probably would have earned me an interview without coffee in a windowless room somewhere. But we now regularly share these things as industry and government, which is, I think, a good litmus test of how far we've come. So we have, as a global collective, come a long way, and long may that continue.
Thank you so much, David. So really, I think important that you just stress the basics there. It's crucial to get this right if we want to safeguard our systems, but also safeguard our values by which we all live our lives here. And then a bit of a plea from you, I think. We've talked a lot about collaboration between the public and the private sector, but just a plea from you to all the civil servants in the room to make sure that we make that as easy as possible, get the incentives right, make sure the strategies are clear and that kind of the regulatory conditions are right as well to enable the private sector to step in and help in the way that they want to. Thank you so much. And Ian, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be here. I'm Ian McCormack. I work in Lindy's team in the National Cybersecurity Centre, and I've got the overall responsibility for helping to raise the cyber resilience of the UK public sector. And I get to work with brilliant public servants, industry, people like David and others. And I think we are making good progress, and it's really good to hear some of those remarks. We've published the government cybersecurity strategy just over a year ago. We're making really good progress in that. I probably don't really need to say, but I think it is really important just to land as context that as government and indeed as a society, we are entirely and wholly reliant upon technology. And this is, from government, this is everything from the citizen-facing services that many citizens across the nation rely on. It's the functioning government all the way through to our national security and defense capabilities are all reliant upon technology. And of course, it isn't just government as well. I'll also emphasize it's, the role of the private sector, particularly in delivering some of those critical services, our private sector CNI that we also rely on. But the cyber domain is contested, and it's contested by those who would do us harm. And that's cyber criminals who would seek to, for example, steal data, deny access to that data, and then hold us to ransom for it. It is state actors who seek some form of overall strategic advantage through cyber means. So we've got really high stakes here. And I truly believe, and I really think that we need to innovate. We are innovating. We need to innovate strongly and fast to help protect those things that we rely upon against the threat that we face. And a few themes have already been mentioned in opening remarks, from collaboration, how we work together, how we work with industry, building reliance and resilience in from the outset, secure by design skills. One area I particularly want to touch on, because I think this is really important for how we innovate in cybersecurity, is the role of data and the role that data plays. And that's a real key theme for me. So, for example, if we are to protect the services that we rely upon, we're to protect our technology, we need to know what we've got, and we need to know what we've got at a really precise level so that we can understand whether a vulnerability impacts upon us. We can understand whether the threat could exploit that vulnerability. Our risk-based decisions, historically, they've been quite subjective. They've been based on judgment, expert judgment, but judgment nonetheless. But I think we need to be a little bit more objective around some of those decisions and ensure that those decisions are informed by evidence. And some of our active cyber defense services can really provide some of that. And Lindy mentioned a couple of services that we've launched quite recently that can give real data that can drive properly objective decisions, which is a good thing. And the other thing that data can do for us, and I think this can make a real difference, is it can enable us to spot things and to be able to respond really fast. So, for example, if by taking a very data-driven approach to cybersecurity, you can spot that precursor activity before ransomware deploys its payload, you can stop it before you get ransomed. That can be really, really powerful. So how do we do more of that as a collective, as a public sector? And then finally, I think perhaps the next iteration, next sort of perhaps step on from that is starting to think about how can we automate some of this so that we can start to take those decisions, we can start to defend ourselves at the kind of speed that we need to in order to be resilient for the future.
Great, thank you so much. So in addition to everything we'd heard about all of those other criteria for innovation, you're bringing in the role of data there, so knowing what we have, so being able to see where we're most vulnerable, and then using data as well to identify risks and being able to respond at pace to those, and then looking ahead maybe to automation and what role that might play in cyber security. Thank you once again to our fantastic speakers for their opening remarks. I'm going to throw it straight open to the audience because I'm sure we have lots of questions. Can I just say, there was a gentleman that stopped me outside and said he'd tried to ask a question in every session he'd been in and hadn't been able to. Do you have a question? If you are that person and you have a question now, do you want to put your hand up? This is going to be the one session where you don't have an immediate question, isn't it? Shout at me if I've missed you. If not, okay. Anybody else? Hands up. Yes, so we have a lady here and the gentleman next to you. 2 questions down the front.
Hiya. Oh God, I need to stand up. Sorry.
Please
I hate
do.
public speaking. I can also hear myself, which is horrible. I don't work in digital. I don't know much about cybersecurity. But I've been told that if you make something too secure, you can almost make it insecure. So a good example is passwords. I don't know if anyone remembers, like back in the day, you used to be able to just put any password in. My first password ever was Hotpoint because I had a Hotpoint fridge. And now you've got to put like an exclamation mark, a capital letter, numbers. So what do you do when you know you're not going to be able to remember the password? You usually write it down, put it on a sticky note. So my question is, how do you tackle that? How do you stop making something so secure that it almost becomes insecure?
Thank you. I really love that question because I think that's something that loads of people will be thinking. Who's got a kind of book full of their passwords written down somewhere? Was there a question next to you as well? We're going to take 2 questions. No? Is it a similar question? Okay, let's take one more question. So lady there in the green cardigan, and then I'll come to you for the next set of questions. So we'll take 2 at a time.
Hi, sorry. So quick question for me. One thing the UK did was have almost an advertisement about cybersecurity to upskill citizens. I wonder if it's time to do that again, and what the panel thinks about that, and whether the US has done something similar as well.
Was this the Fatima advert?
I think it was the don't buy a book that's called
Oh,
Passwords
sorry, I thought it was
Fast.
your next job could be in cyber. Okay, so a kind of public campaign for upskilling on cyber, and then the question that I really like about passwords. Lindy, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'm going to come to you
Brilliant.
first.
So you're giving me flashbacks to some of my worst moments. The Fatima ballerina moment was about a week after I started this job, basically, and my team came to me and said, right, you have to go and tell number 10. I won't continue the conversation. Anyway, it was an interesting moment. If I start on passwords, you're absolutely right, basically. So that's a really great example of people not taking into consideration the user. So we came up with some brilliant research in NCSC that said that actually it was safe enough just to use 3 random words as a password. So, you know, bank, book, hill, any 3 random words, as long as they're not connected. And that would give you a long enough password that was hard enough to guess that actually it would do for most things. And the good thing about that is it's much easier to remember. If you try it, then actually it's much easier to remember. Then what we needed to do was actually think about how it was we got government services to default onto letting you use the advice that we gave rather than demanding some incredibly complicated password. The same is true also for two-factor authentication, where we really want people to use two-factor authentication, but if you're not careful, it becomes in itself a whole extra layer of, you know all these services where they demand that you remember the answer to some question, you can't even remember what the question was. So there is something really important about just making sure we don't make the human the weak point in this whole system, and that we actually default to how it is users use technology. By default, try and make it as secure as possible, rather than sort of expecting the human will compensate for the technology, but also understanding how normal people who are not cybersecurity experts actually use it. So I think there is something really important in the innovation in all this, of making sure that we actually think about how the system works, how the human interacts with the technology, and get that right. If I may, on the campaign, a fantastic advert. In fact, we have launched this week the most recent round of our Cyber Aware campaign. And the reason I was up at 6:20 this morning doing Times Radio, much to my horror, was because we were advertising the services I mentioned earlier, actually, because this year's campaign is focused on small and micro enterprises. Last year we focused on citizens. This year we want to focus on small businesses. And we run a bit of a sort of wave of trying to get different sections of society. So you will see actually some of the advertising around town, I hope, and listen to it on the radio. We definitely think that public messaging is a really important part of upskilling the whole society and helping people understand not just actually how they can get safer themselves, but actually how they help their family, but also all employees are also, normal citizens. If you're more aware of your cybersecurity in your personal life, you're more likely to listen to that advice at work that says, actually, please be careful of that phishing link, or please do change your password and don't just reuse the one you've used before. So we think that a general increase in awareness really helps. I often joke that I grew up with a father who worked as a human resources manager in a chemical plant, and so I grew up with a fairly heavy focus on health and safety as a child, knowing that if you put your seatbelt on in the car on the way to work, you were less likely to stick your hand in the machine when you got to work. And so I have a sort of fairly strong belief that actually if we help people to do the little stuff well, then it helps them to understand why we think that they need to pay attention to some of the more sophisticated and complicated advice.
Thanks, Lindy. Claire, did you want to come in on passwords and public campaigns?
Yeah, the new National Cyber Strategy is focusing on some of that public education. We've had a couple incidents, Colonial Pipeline. Many communities have ransomware attacks on their local hospital, and that has brought that into the consciousness of the American public. And so they are actually asking us to help secure these systems. And part of the National Cyber Strategy is actually moving the burden, shifting the burden from the individual, the small business, the local community to those best positioned to be an intermediary, whether that's the federal government or it's our private sector businesses that are best positioned to support. But education, including STEM education, educating children in school, is all part of the strategy that we have developed, because this is the moment in time where we all have to lean into this. And while cybersecurity isn't something we wish we had to talk about, it is essential, especially we're doing a lot of work with kids in school, right? Kids are sharing an enormous amount of information online, not ever thinking about the consequences of, somebody asked me for my address, so I gave them my address. And we don't know at this moment, what the use of that is, but we know that I don't want my kids doing that. So we are assuming that most people feel exactly the same way. And it's incumbent upon us to actually provide that education and make it consumable so that people can apply it directly to their own lives.
Thanks. I know there's lots of questions, but do any of our other panelists want to come back on the password issue? Any tips on the password issue?
So I will also something in the risk of following Lindy and Claire is there's not much left, but I will point out that to elaborate on Lindy's point, what we know is that the most secure password is simply long. It doesn't have to be complex. You don't have to change it all the time. And so we are moving actively away from requiring ridiculously complex passwords. We actually have, we are measured by the office where Claire works on whether we're eliminating the need to change passwords by implementing so once we implement multi-factor authentication, we're then told, hey, stop requiring people to change their passwords. It's not good. There's one system at DOE, which I will point out, I don't own it, but every time I log in, I swear I have to change my password. And the requirements has to be at least 12 characters long, has to have a capital, and it has to have a special character in the first 3 characters of the password. Let me tell you, that's written down. I guarantee you that is, I'm not telling you where it's written down, but it's written down. So it's critically important. It's not that it's too secure, it's too hard, and it can't be too hard. So I just wanted to emphasize that point because it's such a problem, going forward to expect people to be able to be successful in that kind of world. So.
Thanks, Anne. Ian, you wanted to come in.
Just really briefly, because I really loved the question, because it really shows some of the journey that we've been through as the NCSC. I mean, I've been in the NCSC a long time and the precursor organisation, and I remember actually doing the maths to work out the randomness of passwords back in the day when we ignored people. And I think we sort of learned the hard way, actually, that security has to be usable, because otherwise people develop coping strategies because they have to get the job done, and that can be that itself can lead to insecurities. So it's a brilliant question. I mean, just on passwords, I mean, Linda mentioned that we recommend 3 random words. It creates a reasonably random password that's quite memorable. We recommend using password managers. I think that's that's a great idea. We also recommend only changing passwords if you've got reason to believe that they may have been compromised in some way. But I really love the question. I think actually the theme of is it usable goes to the heart of so much what we do nowadays in security.
Great, thank you. Brian and David, I'm going to give you an opportunity to come in on the next questions first, if that's okay. So we have a hand up here. I'm going to, just for efficiency, I'm going to take these 2 here, and then I'll come to these 2 here, okay, next. So hand there, and then we have a lady in the front. Thank you.
This question is for everyone on the panel. One, you guys have provided us with an overview of great programs and efforts out there. So my question, or questions twofold, is one, what are you doing to recruit, retain the workforce to execute these endeavors, one, and how are you doing it in a way that is inclusive and factoring diversity so the cyber workforce looks like this panel versus the other half of the panel?
Great question.
Thank you.
Great question. That pulls together so many themes from today. How do we recruit and retain cyber kind of professionals, and how do we make sure that that recruitment is inclusive? And then we had a question here.
Thank you, Siobhan, and I rather humbly follow that brilliant question. So my name is Patsy Wilkinson. I used to be a security and digital leader in government. I now work with Nominet and various other organisations. So my question is a kind of futurology question for any or all of the panel, which is if you were to look ahead 5 years, and one thing has happened that you think will foster innovation in cybersecurity, what would that one thing be?
Okay, so what one thing will foster innovation in cybersecurity? Okay, David, I'm going to come to you first, and then Brian. You can answer one or both of those questions.
I'll start with one.
Great.
I can speak for, I think, for Nominet, and I can speak for, I think, the wider industry. I think, what are we going to do to recruit, retain the skills required? I think we're going to take quite a blended approach, but the core of it is we're going to grow our own talent. And I think cyber skills are reportedly in such a shortage, but I think that's a slight myth, because certain types of cyber skills are in shortage. But actually, if I look at the way we grow talent at Nominet, we've even got a bit of a term for it. We very catchy, osmotic pipelines. There's a program of osmosis that we've observed. And this is essentially, if I give you an example, we have folks who work in customer success. So these are people who are responsible for onboarding clients who have not come from a cybersecurity background at all. And we've noticed a kind of process of skills osmosis that occurs when we sit them next to our DNS analysts. So these are people who are looking at DNS traffic. They're quite technical. They're not as technical as some people within the cyber world. They're not necessarily cyber domain experts. There's a bar that is attainable for a customer success person by sitting next to and working with a DNS analyst. And we sit our DNS analysts occasionally next to our threat hunters, who are people with specific offensive cybersecurity knowledge, who think like hackers, who have deep technical skills. And over time, as our customer success people are starting to look like junior DNS analysts, our more senior DNS analysts are starting to look like junior threat hunters, and so it goes on. And I think there's a temptation to try and buy your skills. I think any organization that is serious about cybersecurity now is looking as well. I mean, obviously there are some skills that you will just have to buy from the market. And I think that you've got to look at growing your own. And I think the challenge for the public sector then is to how to hang on to that talent. And I think we could have an entirely different conference just on that topic alone. And some of that was being discussed this morning.
Thank you. So that real cross-pollination
yes.
we're doing. Brian, I said I would come to you on.
Yeah, you know, I'll take a shot at the second question. Excellent question. And while I don't claim to be a futurist on this, I do think that oftentimes the biggest innovations come from some of the biggest challenges we have. And when I look at cybersecurity writ large today, we are living in a world of information overload. So we have really tackled, from an information technology perspective, the ability to instrument a lot of what's happening. We have a lot of telemetry and visibility to what's happening, what our users are doing, what our systems are seeing, what our networks are doing. But if you're somebody in the field of cybersecurity, you're getting information overload in terms of how many different indicators and signals am I trying to respond to and react to, right? It is really difficult to sit there and understand what to watch and how to do the correlation from one thing to the next. And so I think what we're seeing now in some of the advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning, I think the promise of that is starting to come to fruition in a way that obviously we've all seen even in the last 90 days. But the ability to do some more sophisticated correlations, to take the human out of the loop for earlier stages of kind of cyber anomaly detection and response, and be able to do almost autonomic, right, near real-time responses to certain things in a way that doesn't just rely on the user or the person. I think that's going to be a really significant shift that we're going to see over the next 5 years. And I'm excited in some what I'm seeing in the national laboratories, in the private sector, on some of the innovations that are happening there. So that's going to be transformative.
So I'm being told that we have 5 minutes left, but I want to make sure, do any of our government reps here want to respond on the diversity question at all? Yeah, Claire.
I actually think number 2 will partially be answered by part B of the question, which is diversity and inclusion and making sure that we are recruiting people from all walks of life across a really diverse, geographically diverse, ethnically diverse because people come at problems with different mindsets. And it is really critical that we are thinking dimensionally about cybersecurity. You know, we had one federal agency where, most of the passwords for high-value systems were password. Right, right, and those are problems we can solve, right? And we have to continue to look at these. But somebody was interesting in asking the question, and I think that's what diversity does in a workforce, is just allows you to come at something with a little bit different perspective.
Thanks, Claire. So we're going to have to be really quick, but I did promise we would squeeze in 2 questions, and they were at the back. So the lady who's just put her hand up there. Did anyone? And yeah, and there. So we'll take those. If you can keep your questions as short as possible, and then I'm going to ask each of our speakers just to choose one of the questions to answer. Okay.
Hiya, so I'm a first-year DDAT fast streamer based in the Department for Education, and if I keep my question really quick, I'm currently working on the CAF framework, trying to think about compliance activity to assess cyber assessments, and I wanted to know if you had any advice in filtering that down to the non-technical levels or the non-traditionally security levels.
Okay, I hope you all understood that question. It was slightly technical from me. Okay, you're pointing towards Ian to answer that. Okay, and the second question, thank you for that question. And the second question here.
Yeah, my question was, from your experience, what does necessity really look like? Because for me, from this conference, that's the mother of invention. So if you could help with that, thank you.
So what does necessity, what do you mean, what are the absolute things that we absolutely have to do? Strip it back to that. Okay, 2 questions to finish. Ian, Lindy is volunteering you for the first question, so I'm going to start with you.
Brilliant, no, thank you. No, thanks for the question. So the CAF was referenced there, that stands for the Cyber Assessment Framework. This is a framework we put together in the NCSC, which we work in partnership with the sector leadership across a number of different sectors, private sector CNI as well as government sector, to develop a profile for how that assessment framework applies to understand and be able to improve the cybersecurity across the sector. So inevitably, it is a lot in there, and it is quite complex. How I would drill it down, I mean, it breaks down into 4 chunks broadly. One is prepared. Do you understand what we've got? Do you understand the technology systems that underpin the critical function? If you've got the right management systems in place and so on. Are you protecting those appropriately? Putting in place a kind of protective measure to expect. Can you detect if something's going wrong? And then how do you respond to that? Minimize harm and recover. I mean, that's broadly what the CAF's about, but there's a lot of detail in there. Loads of information on our website if you're interested.
Thank you so much. David?
I'll take necessity, if I may. I remember watching a presentation given about 10 years ago by Alex Stamos, who I think at the time was CISO at either Yahoo or Facebook, and he said, software will eat this problem in about 30 years' time. And I think that's the journey that we're on, and necessity. I think Claire used the phrase DevSecOps earlier on, and I think this is a key element of what I'm about to say, which is that once we get to a place where and this is not just software, by the way, but where our architectures and so much of what the infrastructure that we use today is secure by design, then I think that is probably our best hope for taking away a meaningful chunk of this problem and this risk. But that is, unfortunately, whilst it is necessary, it's probably a journey that we're kind of 15 years into, and we may have another 15 or 20 years more to run on. So that's my necessity.
Thank you. Brian, your necessity.
I was going to take on the first question. There was an element in there around translation from technical to non-technical. And much as Lindy spoke a little bit about the need for human-centered design principles and how we deploy things, the other big one is effective communications and communicators embedded in a cyber function. I mean, we've got phenomenal security analysts and engineers, but they're not always the best communicators, right? So how do you really insert that communications element? And start with the why when you do that. It's not just about cascading controls and telling them the what, right, and the how. It's the why. And when you can start there and you can make that a compelling case, I think you can really, and if you can't find a good why, then you should really question the nature of the control or the method of your implementation. And I think that's an incredibly important point for that translation.
Thank you so much. Anne?
So to maintain the symmetry, I will take the necessary question, although I will say that just as an aside, we've been working on values for my organization. why over what is one of the ones that we picked. But a second necessity, I will say, is a risk-based approach to security. It's very easy to get into a compliance mindset. Certainly, the various government agencies in the US give us lots of compliance activities, and it's not just you, but you guys help. We have to look at our risk. We can't simply say, well, we're gonna go down the list and do A, B, C, and D. It really has to be a focus, regardless of who's telling you what to do. What's the greatest likelihood? What's the greatest impact? And rank those things and say, I gotta take care of this. And it doesn't matter if someone's yelling at me to take care of that. I gotta do this because that's where my greatest risk is, and that's where the greatest impact will be.
Thanks, Anne. Claire?
I think I'm going to go with necessity for 200 points. We are in some ways failing our customers. We are not delivering the services that they deserve, and COVID brought that to light. Our customers are expecting us to be equivalent to the private sector services that they have rely on every single day. And so I think that making sure that you are relentlessly focused on the customer is the necessity that is the mother of invention.
Thank you. And Lindy, the last words to you.
So I'm going to look back to all the previous questions, including one from Patsy. So I think what will drive change in the next 5 years is, first of all, crisis. There's no doubt that what we saw a couple of years ago in the US in particular is the understanding by non-cybersecurity experts of how existential a cyber crisis could be absolutely drove a step change in international collaboration. And I think collaboration is the second one. The US has 3,000 utilities. Israel has 1 in some of these sectors. We can learn from both because governments can do different things with sectors that look different. And understanding actually what works in different societies, I think, will really help us pick the best and all learn from each other. But if I can finish perhaps on that question about diversity. So the weekend before last, I was in Belfast for the awards dinner for Cyber First Girls, which is my best weekend of the year, with a bunch of 12 and 13-year-old girls who'd participated in our Cyber First Girls competition. And we took them all for a prize dinner in Belfast, a tour of the Titanic Museum. And basically, it was just fantastic. It was 100 kids who had no idea they were interested in cybersecurity, who just loved solving puzzles, cracking problems, and who had never thought about doing computer science GCSE. And there are fantastic stories of people who participated in that program and some of the other bursaries we run, some of the other programs we run, who think about this as a career in the way that they hadn't previously because they thought this frankly, for geeks who wanted to sit in the computer center. And I think actually we really have to do more to try and make this an accessible profession, but also to explain this is about the future of technology. This is a big future, not a small niche future. This is something where we need that diversity, the mix of minds as we talk about in GCHQ. And the person we brought along to speak to them was Hannah Kalik Brown, who's the star of The Undeclared War, who plays in a TV program that's basically based in a cybersecurity agency, plays a young woman from an Asian background whose family want her to work in a bank rather than in an intelligence agency, and who defies all those stereotypes to go and work in and crack problems nobody else can crack. That mix of minds is absolutely what will get us innovation in the future in this sector.
Thank you so much, and that's a really lovely, I think, upbeat, positive note to end on. I'm being told that I've overrun. I'm very, very sorry, but it was such a fantastic panel, I didn't want to cut it short. Please join me in thanking our brilliant speakers.